The following is a Hoop Ball presentation. Welcome to the Fantasy NBA Today podcast.
I have to admit, I was worried that I wouldn't have something to talk about today. That one went out the window, didn't it? Goodness gracious. And I am not talking about the Manny Machado potential deal in baseball. And I am not talking about these ridiculous Hawks Schroeder Melo discussions, which are also ongoing, because there's some interesting stuff going on. This, by the way, the last 3 days had the potential to be truly boring days in sports. The Major League Baseball All-Star break is when baseball takes a 3-day hiatus. 4-day hiatus? I don't know. But nothing else is really going on. I know that a WNBA player named Cambridge set the all-time scoring record, and it's not fair for me to gloss over that. That's awesome. It's great news. But we have to be truthful with ourselves. Not many of us do watch that stuff. We don't. It's not fair, probably. But we watch what entertains us, and many of us don't feel that that's entertaining. So, fine, whatever. We're not doing commentary on any of that stuff on today's podcast. This is just sort of a downtime, and downtime turned into uptime because trade stuff is just going wild right now. It's also why I think it's important that we didn't start our reviews of all of the individual teams this week, because free agents are still inking their final destinations. We've heard Marcus Smart back to the Celtics. Seems like it is most likely. The Schroeder Melo thing that I just mentioned a moment ago. Hawks attempting to move Dennis Schroeder, get out from under that contract, and start over with that Trey kid. I don't know how that works out. Presumably, if Melo got moved to the Hawks, he'd be bought out by Atlanta, end up in either Houston or Los Angeles or something like that, or possibly Philly now, considering Nemanja Bjelica never signed his contract, disappeared to Europe. He did what everybody said Nico Mirotic was going to do. Nemanja Bjelica built himself a freaking raft out of palm fronds and floated back across the Atlantic. Crazy. But of course, the big news of the day and the focus of today's episode of Fantasy NBA Today, a hoop ball presentation. Thank you, by the way, to our good friend Donna for getting us in on this, this glorious Wednesday. Kawhi Leonard has been traded to the Toronto Raptors. I'm just letting that sink in for a minute. I know you guys get pissed when I take quiet breaks on the podcast, but that is a big one. That is a big one that just landed. And there's so many different things that need to be covered. Number one, the betting angle on this stuff. Number two, the reality angle on this stuff. Number three, the fantasy angle on this stuff. And number four, the future aspect of this stuff. And we'll just plow our way through. I am Dan Besbris, solo on this Wednesday. Neil Rochlani will join me tomorrow, one of my two illustrious co-hosts on this fabulous podcast. And then Neil and Adrian, of course, will wrap up the week on Friday. The plan, by the way, when I went to bed last night, before the trade went down, I think it occurred at about 1 in the morning here on the Pacific Coast, something like that, in the middle of the night stuff going on. Kawhi on a bus east in the middle of the night. Northeast, I should say. When I went to bed last night, I figured I'd wake up this morning, I'd check out whatever the small news pieces of the day were, and then today's podcast would be focused largely on more of the foundational stuff. Adrian and I thought, did a really solid show yesterday to sort of crack open the mock draft nut, as it were. There's so much more to cover on mock drafts and draft prep and just all of that. But it was a beginning to it. So if you want to listen to that show, Adrian and I have very different opinions on how to prep for fantasy mock draft season. We had a lot of fun with it. We're going to be talking more about that. We're going to be talking about trade strategy. We're going to be talking about ranking players, pre-ranking players. What does it all mean, man? What does it all mean, man? But that we'll have to pick up again tomorrow, because today, a top 5 NBA player got moved. And that, of course, is the story. Meanwhile, there are summer thunderstorms happening in Southern California, and I know that there are a lot of folks out there getting ready to make a Paul George joke. Hardy har har. Yes, thunder, summer thunderstorms, Paul George the Thunder, Kawhi got traded somewhere else, so are the Lakers going to miss out on Kawhi? We'll cover that stuff at the end of the podcast on what I think is going to happen in the future. But the order of operations here is, number one, the sports betting stuff. Because that really told us a lot about what was about to happen. There was a long stretch where it seemed like the Lakers were the likely destination. But when LeBron's camp came out and said that they didn't need another superstar right away, those numbers tapered off. I was of the opinion, I thought he would open the season as a spur. I thought San Antonio would just hang on for dear life here. But apparently he's been very overt in his discussions, both with the media and with the Spurs themselves. We hear these stories leak and we write them off a little bit. Oh, well, Kawhi might sit out parts of the season with San Antonio. I'm inclined to believe that he told the Spurs he definitely would sit out the beginning of the season. Because if they felt like he was going to play even one game for them, and they could showcase how good he still was and how potentially healthy he still was, they would have done that and waited and gotten more for him. And I know you're about to say, DeMar DeRozan didn't get that much. Don't worry, we'll get to that point of the podcast. About a week ago, the odds for Kawhi Leonard shifted dramatically, with the Raptors all of a sudden the prohibitive favorites with no big news stories that went along with it. So this was money coming in without a breaking news story. That is very unusual. Almost all of the other shifts in the Kawhi Leonard odds or the Paul George odds or the LeBron James odds moved in conjunction with stories leaked to the media. You could always see it and you could say, oh, well, somebody saw the story about LeBron taking a meeting with the Sixers top guys, and so some money came in on the Sixers. But that was all reactionary money. This was money coming in, and a lot of it, by the way. They weren't just going to shift the odds like that unless somebody made a bet. This was money coming in without any of us in the regular world here knowing precisely why. We knew the Raptors were involved, but we also knew the Nuggets, the Sixers, the Celtics, the Lakers, the Clippers. I'm missing somebody, but it doesn't matter. We knew all of those teams were involved in discussions, but that's where we sat. It seemed like, by all accounts, the Celtics and the Sixers had backed off a bit, not knowing about his health, not wanting to give up a bunch of their future when they have such great assets to build on for what could end up being a one-year run. If that. We don't even know if he's going to play for another team. That's a lot of question marks for two Eastern Conference teams with their arrows pointed straight up in a conference that just lost LeBron James. That's a risk that's not worth taking. Not when you can go to the finals potentially every year for a half decade. I don't think those teams felt like adding Kawhi would actually help them beat the Warriors anyway. I think some of the thought there is adding Kawhi might make one of those teams on paper close to as good as Golden State, but in a one-year scenario, you got your one big bullet, and if it doesn't work out, I mean, if you win, yeah, he probably comes back. If you don't, and you lose him, that's a lot to give up to just run into a buzzsaw. A lot of teams, I think, are waiting this thing out, waiting until Draymond Green, by all accounts, by the way, is the guy that's going to make the situation tough for Golden State because he's going to want a big raise, and they're not going to have the money to give it to him. But You wait it out. They're a super team right now. Someone's going to challenge them. And right now, Boston and Philly, they're looking at their team, and Boston in particular, I'm sure, looks at their club and says, listen, we can go to the finals right now. The one team out east, not the Sixers, whose arrow was pointed either sideways or down, was the Toronto Raptors. But something happened behind the scenes. Somebody knew. And big money came in. And we should have probably analyzed that a little bit more when it happened, but there were so many shifts in odds that it just sort of blew under the radar a little bit. So Kawhi Leonard is a Raptor. They can't trade him again until December 15th, I believe, because he was acquired in the offseason. So there is that, call it like a little bit of a moratorium here. There are people talking about how they could just flip him to the Lakers. It doesn't work like that. There has to be a waiting period. And now, Toronto, by all accounts, in the very short term, got better. I mean, there are very few guys in the NBA where you get rid of them and you put Kawhi Leonard in their place. You don't actually get better. Those guys are LeBron, maybe KD, Russ, Steph. I mean, who else is Anthony Davis? Kawhi Leonard, to me, is a top 7 NBA guy. Easy. And then you could probably argue he's top 5. I mean, is he better than any of those guys that I just listed? Someone might say he's better than Steph because of the defensive side of the ball. I don't know what Steph does on offense. That's not what this podcast is for. We're not going to argue who the best player in the NBA is. I was just mentioning the Raptors fans are pretty upset right now. So now let's move a little bit here into the reality side of things. Raptors fans are pretty upset. But they shouldn't be that upset. I believe the initial response here is more in Toronto's side about the emotional deal. This was DeMar DeRozan was career Raptor, signed the long-term deal when everybody thought he would look around. He didn't even look around. He just wanted to be a Raptor forever. Raptor for life. So he became part of that culture. He was drafted in 2009. It's been a while now. That's a decade in Toronto. 9 NBA seasons. He's been extremely durable. He's a 20-point-per-game guy, even when you include the fact that he averaged only 9 points his rookie year. 2 seasons back, he was incredible. I mean, just otherworldly stuff. He started to add the three-pointer a little bit. His passing has consistently improved. Not a big steals guy, but he's not terrible on the defensive end. High volume, solid free throw shooter. I mean, you're talking about a guy that was the face of the Raptors franchise. He was the face of it. Sorry, Kyle Lowry. I know that the advanced metrics show you're a more important player for Toronto, but DeRozan was the face of the franchise. Southern California kid, face of the Raptors franchise. And they traded him. And so for Raptors fans, there's this punch to the gut immediately. Sock right to the midsection. Where they feel like they got bludgeoned. They brought in a guy in Kawhi Leonard who nobody really knows how healthy he is. Will he even play? Nobody knows. Probably. I bet he will. I think he'll play. I don't think he's going to hold out on Toronto. That seems sort of unfair. Although the whole thing is just like petty on all sides at this point. So there's this growing discontent right out of the chute that Toronto just traded for a guy that might not even suit up for them and gave away the face of their franchise. And I get that. But Toronto's pointed down right now. Guys, they sort of, I hate to frame it like this, but they kind of fired their bullet too soon. Not that they could really choose when their players were going to be at their peak and deals were going to be able to jam together like this. But Kyle Lowry, one would certainly argue, on the second half of his career. DeMar DeRozan, 9 years in. You could probably argue he's at least starting the second half of his career at this point, if not into it by a year or two. That's not to say that he's not better than he ever has been, but it's downward. Serge Ibaka, very much on the downward slope of his career. And they had a couple of decent young guys. Freddie VanVleet, solid. Jakob Poeltl, who was traded in this deal, has been solid. Jonas Valanciunas is fine. But they had their moments. The last couple of years, Toronto was very good and could not deal with LeBron James. And so their choices, the Raptors' choices, as the front office now, Masai Ujiri making these difficult decisions, their choices were run it back again with the same lineup. And you know what? Maybe they do get to the finals. And that wouldn't be a bad thing. But Boston's coming for them. They're getting better. Philly's getting better. And Toronto's just going to get worse every year, either quickly or slowly. I don't know the answer to that side. Over the next 3 or 4 seasons, but Lowry's contract will expire and DeRozan's contract will expire after a couple of years. And then you're hitting full reset. You either try to bring those guys back in old age or you're starting from scratch. And what they've done with this trade is they have gotten a 1-year rental from a top 5 guy who gives them sort of one chance to try to beat the Boston Celtics and the Philadelphia 76ers and make the NBA Finals. And hell, maybe you convince Kawhi to stick around. But even if you don't, DeRozan's near $30 million contract is off the books now, and Kawhi's will be off the books after 1 year. So then the next question becomes, what about the rest of the Raptors? When do their contracts come off the books? They have a pretty big payroll, by the way. Serge Ibaka this year and next year. Kyle Lowry this year and next year. And so what this does now for Toronto is it shortens the amount of time that they're going to have to sit on money. They can start their rebuild quicker. Not by much, but by a little. And when you get Lowry or Ibaka on the last year of their deals, well, maybe they can try to swing a trade for them as well. But it does give them one big shot. And then you start to rebuild a little quicker. It's not the worst deal in the world, Toronto fans. You guys were pretty hamstrung for the next year and a half anyway, which you could also argue was a reason to just stick with DeRozan for 2 years and see what happens. But Kawhi Leonard is better than DeMar DeRozan. He's a better basketball player. He can do more things. He makes Toronto better in this 1 year. It also means that Jonas Valanciunas has a little bit more space to operate, but we'll get to the fantasy ramifications of that in just a moment. So to me, I kind of like this deal for the Raptors. I don't think Kawhi Leonard ultimately re-signs with them, but again, we'll talk about that in the future segment of this. Let's not worry about that just yet. Over on the Spurs side, San Antonio managed to get an all-star back, which is a pretty big deal when you consider what they could have gotten. But on the other side of that, by all accounts, they were looking for some pretty significant young pieces to build around, and they didn't get that. So the Spurs have sort of jammed themselves into playoff purgatory. It's nice that they got DeMar DeRozan, who's owed $20 million this year, or $28 million this year, $28 million next year, and he has a player option for another 28 bones the following season, 2020 to 2021. LaMarcus Aldridge is also signed through that year, so the Spurs have $50-some-odd million in payroll locked up for 3 seasons. Patty Mills, by the way, also locked up for 3 seasons, so they have about $65 million jammed into those 3 dudes. Pau Gasol, 2 years on his thing. And I guess if you're the Spurs, your thought was, well, we've got LaMarcus Aldridge tied up for another 3 seasons. Starting a rebuild immediately doesn't make sense. Aldridge, with whatever random goobers the Spurs put around him, are going to fight for the last playoff spot. And that's nowhere to be if you want to rebuild. So they bring in DeMar DeRozan in this trade, and they figure, you know what, let's just be decent for a few years. Are they a championship contender? Absolutely not. Are they even in the top 3 or 4 in the Western Conference? I don't think so. But they certainly are better this year now than they were last year because Kawhi didn't play. And the Spurs made the postseason with LaMarcus Aldridge and those guys. Yeah, I said those guys because most of you probably couldn't even name 4 other Spurs. Rudy Gay, I think, will be better this season. We've talked about that. Jakob Poeltl is really stuck behind Aldridge and Pau Gasol. There's just no room at all for him. I don't know why he was the guy they ended up pulling in that deal, but perhaps they'll find some room for him. I just don't know where. Haven't a clue. They got 3 centers on the roster now. I mean, they really barely can play Aldridge and Gasol at the same time. You're not going to see a whole lot of Aldridge-Poeltl lineups, but I guess because Jakob can move, those have a little bit more legs than Aldridge-Gasol. But this crushes Jakob. Elsewhere, we haven't talked about the Spurs in a little bit. DeJounte Murray, with Tony Parker out of town, obviously has the stranglehold on the point guard job. Patty Mills will be that gunner off the bench. And then it's a whole bunch of who knows who. Davis Bertans just signed for a couple of years. I think Bryn Forbes is back. There's some room to operate here, but certainly bringing in DeMar DeRozan crushed that. Whatever space I thought Rudy Gay was going to fill. It seemed like this team was going to badly need scoring and playmaking. When they lost Slow-Mo, they lost an old Tony Parker. It was really going to be Aldridge and the Funky Bunch. And then Rudy Gay, coming back now 2 years removed from injury, could have been helpful. But DeMar DeRozan coming in, he is going to take a lot of shots. He is going to be playing in San Antonio's grind-it-to-a-halt pace, and his numbers are going to suffer. I know a lot of people look at this and they're like, Greg Popovich is going to turn him into the all-NBA mega monster we've always hoped for. I am going to be forced to rain on that parade because Toronto this season allowed him to become as close to that guy as his fantasy stat set will allow. DeRozan took 18 shots a game for Toronto. LaMarcus Aldridge took 18 shots a game for San Antonio. Those two things cannot exist in the same space anymore. There's going to be a hit on both of them. It just has to be, unless they pick up their tempo in a significant way, and I just don't see that happening. Maybe a little bit, but not a lot. Fantasy-wise, DeMar DeRozan, 9 category last year, finished in the mid-40s. I think you're looking at a guy who's going to be sitting just outside the top 50 and probably overdrafted. LaMarcus Aldridge finished inside the top 20 on the shoulders of his terrific percentages, decent defensive stats, points and rebounds. He was a I'm not going to hurt you in too many places kind of fantasy guy. And the percentages should stay pretty good for Aldridge. I don't see any reason why those should taper off. But just opportunity is going to taper off a little bit. They brought in another center, which could hurt rebounding a tiny bit. And they brought in a scorer, a proven scorer, and they've got these mid-range guys going crazy. I don't know how Aldridge averages 23 points per game again next year. Even if that comes down to 21, it'll be a little bit of a hit. So Aldridge and DeRozan, I think, are going to be overdrafted. I think Kawhi Leonard is worth drafting somehow. I don't know where you go for him, but he'll put up strong numbers. I don't know that this impacts the other guys around, the other superstars in Toronto, if you want to call them that. You see the steady decline of a Serge Ibaka, Kyle Lowry. They're continuing to try to play him less during the regular season, so I think there's going to be some consistency with those dudes. I think the one place you look and say, well, maybe there's some room for improvement would be Valanciunas now. With Poeltl being shipped out, it does open up a lot of center minutes, and I don't think all of those go to Serge, and I don't think they all would go to a combo of Serge and Siakam. You have to believe that Valanciunas gets a small piece of that pie. And for Valanciunas, he did finish inside the top 75. It was 13-9 last year with 1 block per game, 57% from the field and 81% at the free throw line. If he moves from 22.5 minutes to 25 minutes, that's the type of thing that bumps him up around. So, top 75 to top 65, something like that. So there may be a little bit of value in Valanciunas. Just don't go into this year like everybody always convinces you to and expect him to be a top 50 guy. He just doesn't. He's not that guy, and he's never going to get that many minutes in the modern NBA. He's too slow. He'll have those games where he goes bonkers against Andre Drummond and Dwight Howard, and when they need him on the floor to push some bigger dudes away from the basket. But there are so many teams now that go small, and Valanciunas he's not good enough to impose himself on those clubs. It slows down the pace too much. But all those negative thoughts, push him aside for a minute. When you just look at it from a pure numbers standpoint, if he gets a 10% bump in playing time, it's a good thing. It's a good thing. So to me, from the fantasy side of things, the winner in this madness today is Jonas Valanciunas. I think Aldridge takes a hit. I think DeRozan takes a hit. I think Lowry stays almost exactly the same. I think Ibaka stays almost exactly the same. I think Rudy Gay takes a hit from his... They were going to be hypothetical numbers at this point. The only guy where minutes actually opened up a little bit was Jonas. All right, that's your fantasy outlook on the team. We sort of jumped over the reality stuff. The reality stuff is that, as I just mentioned before, the Raptors, if Kawhi Leonard is healthy and plays a full season with them, should be able to do similar stuff to what they did last year. Boston gets a little better. Philly gets a little better. Indiana gets a little better. Cleveland gets way worse. And if you're trying to figure out, where a win might come here and there, this type of trade does, I think, give the Raptors a little bit of a chip on their shoulder. But I hope that it turns out to be a good chip. There's this talk right now of the Raptors trading Kyle Lowry's best buddy, so what does that do for his mindset? I think by opening night, if Kyle Lowry is playing with a healthy Kawhi Leonard, he'll be feeling fine. He and DeMar DeRozan, they can have their relationship. There's a long life after all of that stuff. But there's a possibility that maybe things sting a little bit. I think that they're ultimately going to be professionals and they're going to play hard. There's going to be a little bit of an adjustment period, but I'm very curious to see what the win total looks like for that Raptors team. I think they're going to be pretty good. People are going to be up in arms about what might happen after the season, and I hope that drives the number down with the notion of, maybe Kawhi Leonard sits out, maybe they trade him mid-season. I think he just plays all year with Toronto and then goes wherever he wants after that. The Spurs is a funny one because they're not as good as they would have been with Kawhi and Aldridge both healthy, but they are certainly better than they were last year when it was just basically Aldridge. So the Spurs become a player in the Western Conference fight for the bottom half of the playoffs again. I thought they were going to miss the playoffs this coming year because I thought Kawhi was going to sit out, and I thought they'd trade for youth, and instead they got a guy that can actually contribute. So from a reality standpoint, Spurs are going to be better than they were last year. Raptors have a chance to be about as good as they were last year. They've still got most of their guys that made a difference. Outside, of course, of DeMar DeRozan. What about the future? That's got to be the last thing that we talk about on today's podcast, and it's a big one. Make no mistake, that's one massive aspect of today's deal. What happens next year? Well, on the Spurs side, the answer is quite clear. They have these guys, and they're jammed into contracts for a couple of seasons. So they're now pretty stuck. Unless they swing a bunch of other trades, which I don't know that that's on the horizon. The Raptors is the interesting side of this discussion. What happens next year? As I mentioned just a moment ago, the Raptors still have Kyle Lowry, Serge Ibaka. There's a lot of dudes on that team that aren't going anywhere for a couple of seasons. Valanciunas, by the way, is a player option for $18 million, not this coming season, but the following one, which, given the current big man market, he probably exercises that option. So Lowry, Ibaka, Valanciunas, Norman Powell, Freddie VanVleet. The Raptors have, even if you wipe off Kawhi Leonard's next year and CJ Miles has a $9 million player option, even if you assume they both decline those, and Miles might actually opt into his, by the way, that still puts the Raptors at almost $100 million for 2019, and we're not even at the start of 2018 yet. That's a lot of money on the books. Danny Green comes off the books, by the way. That's, I guess, one very small deal here. So, yes, the speed up of the rebuild is very minor. They at $100 million, they can find some way to try to spend that cash. It's not that many choices if you're not signing dudes that are already on your team. Do I think Kawhi Leonard ends up getting convinced to stay in Toronto? I think the answer is no. Toronto's a lovely city. There's a lot of stuff going around on the internet about, why would you pick Toronto over Los Angeles? There are reasons for both. But one of the very big reasons in all of this that Kawhi Leonard isolated Los Angeles in his pursuit is that he's from Riverside. Toronto is about as far from Riverside as you can get in the NBA. In fact, it might actually be the farthest. Someone could fix me on that, I'm sure. But I think it's about as far as you can get. He didn't want to play on the East Coast. Seems like he prefers the simple life of the West Coast. I think he wants to be closer to home. I think he wants to be in LA. And I do think that quietly here we've had this weird Shams versus Woj thing. Kawhi Leonard wants to play for the Clippers. Kawhi Leonard wants to play for the Lakers. He doesn't want to be with LeBron. He does want to be with LeBron. If his issue is that he was getting overlooked, either one of those teams would create a certain measure of that. The Clippers are going to get overlooked because they're the Clippers. That's just how it is here in Los Angeles. Clipper fans, you guys know exactly what I'm talking about. And if it's the Lakers, yeah, it's going to be LeBron's team for a couple of years. But if he signs a 4-year deal with LA, by the end of that deal, he'll probably be the better player between he and Bron. So there is some, and there's a patience aspect to it. So I don't know that that's necessarily going to be the case. Does this turn into another Paul George thing? It could. Toronto, they have a lot to lose here, but they had sort of little to lose anyway, if that makes sense. They have this unbelievably narrow window before Boston gets too good and Philly gets too good And LeBron now left, so they figured, the hell with it. Let's see if we can turn ourselves two-dimensional and just slip through this tiny crack in the window. Zoop! You got to be a paper thin. But they're going paper thin. They said, the hell with it, screw it, we're going all in. And if it works, fantastic. And if it doesn't cost them that much, because they were, one would argue, 2.5 years from needing to tear it all down anyway. And they've just shortened that to 1.5 years. With a year of relative mediocrity instead of a year of slightly meaningful competitiveness. That's the trade-off here. Toronto took their 2019-20 season, which, if they left everything unchanged, was probably going to be a top 4 or 5 finish in the Eastern Conference. That's pretty good. But probably not a championship. And they turned that year, if Kawhi leaves, into probably still a playoff team out east, but maybe just sneaking into it with kind of bad draft picks. And ultimately, they're going to lose in the first or second round. So not that different. I don't know how the optics might be. They do love their Raptors up there, so I'm guessing people would just sort of embrace whatever comes out. So they took that change. They took that slight dip 2 seasons from now. They applied it to this coming year and said, you know what? With our current makeup, Lowry, DeRozan, Ibaka, Valanciunas, we're not going to win a championship, and we might not win the East. With Kawhi Leonard healthy, we have a pretty good shot to win the East. Kawhi Leonard, boy, looking at these other players around there, he might be the best player in the Eastern Conference. Is he better than anybody on the Sixers? Yeah, I think so. Is he better on anybody on the Celtics? Kyrie, maybe. I think Kawhi's better. Oladipo? I'd take Kawhi. It's funny, we don't really look at it from this perspective all that often, but look at your fantasy draft and tell me how many guys. Giannis, I guess, is your closest guy. No, Giannis Antetokounmpo. Kawhi Leonard? Maybe I go Giannis. All right, so maybe Kawhi's the second best player in the East. But you could make an argument he's better. Their best games right now, Kawhi Leonard, I would argue, has a better impact on the game. Top 6 players last year in fantasy on a per-game basis, all in the Western Conference now. And out of the first round, the only other Eastern Conference guy is Oladipo. Kyrie Irving was number 14. That's the next time you get to another Eastern Conference guy. Anthony Davis, Steph Curry, Kevin Durant, James Harden, Karl Anthony Towns, LeBron now in the West, Damian Lillard, Chris Paul, Jimmy Butler, Nikola Jokic. Kawhi Leonard could be the best player in the Eastern Conference. So, if he doesn't want to be overshadowed, I guess there's that. We'll learn more as things develop, but that is your initial look at the Kawhi Leonard, DeMar DeRozan, San Antonio-Toronto swap. July 18th, a big day in the NBA. Superstars on the move. Neil Rochlani will join me on tomorrow's podcast. Neil and Adrian on Friday to wrap it up for the week. I am Dan Besbris. This was Fantasy NBA Today. Hope you enjoyed that one. Please, of course, feel free to tweet any additional questions you have my direction at Dan Besbris on Twitter. Dan is the first name. That's easy. Besbris is Besbris. I started doing it in military style last year, so I'll do it again just once for old time's sake. Bravo, Echo, Sierra. Bravo, Romeo, India, Sierra. Have I ever been in the military? Hard no. I couldn't make it a day. I wouldn't last a day. But I can Google it. And so I learned how to say all those letters. Anyway, hope you guys find me on Twitter. Take a moment to rate and review the podcast if you like what you hear. We are available everywhere. Depending on where you're listening to it right now, we'll be there again on tomorrow's show. Again, I'm Dan Besbris for Fantasy NBA Today. This is your Wednesday edition. Superstar trade day in the NBA. Tomorrow, back to foundational stuff, provided nothing else crazy happens. Who knows? Maybe something will. Have a great Wednesday, everybody. So long.
This has been a Hoop Ball presentation.